Well, this is All Out Politics, news, debate and opinion from the heart of Westminster. Well, on day 3 of this election campaign, the main parties have become locked in a spending war, according to our economics editor, Ed Conway. For the first time in decades, both Labour and the Conservatives have committed themselves to an increase in state borrowing. So what's going on? Here with me in Westminster is Warwick Lightfoot. He's head of Economics and Social Policy at Policy Exchange. And joining us from Edinburgh is Jonathan Portes, Professor of Economics at King's College London and a former Chief Economist at the Cabinet Office. Welcome to you both. Now, I just want to start with a very simple question. Jonathan Portes, what is there to choose between the Labour plans as outlined yesterday and the Conservative plans?
Well, both parties have essentially committed to very similar rules about current spending. That is, that they'll balance the budget in current terms. That if you ignore investment, we'll spend about as much as we tax. So the big difference there is that Labour, because Labour is planning tax increases on relatively wealthy people, and the Conservatives are planning tax cuts. Over time, Labour will spend more and tax more, and the Conservatives will spend less and tax less. So that's one big difference. The second big difference is that both parties are promising very large increases in investment spending to be financed by borrowing rather than by current taxes. Labour is promising rather more than the Conservatives, but both are actually setting out quite ambitious plans for future investment spending.
And Warwick Lightfoot, according to Sajid Javid, his plans are responsible and John McDonnell's are irresponsible. Does that work?
Well, I think what I find interesting, I mean, Jonathan, good morning, and I think Jonathan's encapsulated actually very, very neatly. What I find interesting is the big change in these debates. When we used to work together years ago, people like myself would have been very concerned about the level of borrowing. In circumstances of very low inflation, very low interest rates, the debate that's really been led by the IMF and the OECD, I think there's a recognition across the pitch in the UK that there's a bigger role for borrowing to finance investment and so on. And of course, it's part of a debate going on in places like Germany and in Europe as well. So that's a very big change, and it's a sort of kind of common ground between the parties. What I find equally interesting, and we've done a lot of work at this in Policy Exchange, we produced this paper on the work of the Shadow Chancellor.
Quite a word, that.
Yeah. He's stimulated an absolutely fascinating debate. Very heterodox, often vivid and very colourful in the ideas that have been ventilated. But he does want to bring about a fundamental change in the microeconomics of the economy, the control, the management and the structural change, which will be quite transformational. And of course, they're talking about some of it this morning. I think there's more common ground on the macro stuff. Jonathan, I think quite rightly, has pointed out that there will be constraints on some of the public spending and on some of the investment.
I mean, if I could decode that, what you're really saying is that McDonnell is talking about a lot more state control and a lot more nationalisation.
Yes, and it would fundamentally change the microeconomics of the economy in the medium term. And I would liken it, say, to the common programme of Mitterrand in 1981. And of course, it was the microeconomics in France that actually stuck. So I think this is a very ambitious, transforming agenda, the like of which we haven't seen for about 40 or 50 years. It's a fascinating, and I know that Jonathan follows it very carefully, yes. It's a fascinating debate to actually follow, but it will make very big changes. Interesting enough, the macro stuff, I think, is more rooted in a kind of common argument.
Do you agree with that, Jonathan Portes? And do you actually think that the pace setter, if you like, has become John McDonnell rather than the Treasury under the Conservatives?
I agree almost entirely with what Warwick said. On macroeconomic policy, on fiscal policy, there has been a convergence. In a sense, I'd say that the Tories have ditched austerity, while John McDonnell has essentially gone back to the type of fiscal policy that Gordon Brown was proposing. So there has been this sort of convergence on that. And as Warwick said, the really interesting differences here are John McDonnell's proposals on microeconomics, on who runs companies. Should workers have a greater role in companies, both on the boards and in terms of the ownership of companies? What's the role of the state in directing investment? Things like his proposal to move a significant part of the Treasury to the north in order somehow to bring a greater focus on regional inequalities. As Warwick says, this is very much setting the agenda. will it work? I think it is indeed fascinating and radical. I, like Warwick, have some big question marks about it, but it is indeed setting the agenda.
I mean, what do you think? I mean, you've written this study of John. Well, I mean, how worried are you, or not, perhaps, by these ideas of renationalisation?
Just on the macro stuff, I think actually really that has been the changing character of that debate. I think is very much led by the IMF and the OECD, and the recognition that we all have of Larry Summers' notion of secular stagnation. Later today, I'm going to spend a bit of time doing stationary states, something that Jonathan will be well familiar with as a thing we all need to brush up on. So that's changed it for everybody. And it means that the macroeconomic circumstances we're all dealing with is fundamentally different from the sort of stuff that Jonathan and I used to have to worry about 30 years ago in the Treasury. The micro stuff that John McDonnell's exploring is very radical. I think it will, in the end, blunt incentives in the labour market and in capital markets, and it will be much more difficult to price risk in a precise way and to price labour in a precise way. And I think that the changes in ownership and structures of property rights would have profound implications. In my own judgment, it would be difficult to avoid some of the problems that used to emerge.
Would it end in inequality?
Sorry?
Would it end in inequality?
I doubt that it would actually make very much traction on the fundamental inequalities that arise from income dispersion. I think it may actually raise some very big questions about the efficiency of the way we allocate resources. Because if we are in this world of stagnation and secular states, we've got to be a little bit sharper in making sure we make best use of what we've got, because you can't rely on growth simply to make it all better without you noticing. So I think it carries profound implications, rather like those that the French government had in 1981. And of course, the results come through many years later. If you do something good to improve the supply performance of your economy, you barely notice it for a few years. If you do something that's going to hinder it, again, the hindrance doesn't come through for many years, in my experience.
OK, thank you both very much indeed.
Very good to see you, Jonathan.
This is All Out Politics. Coming up next.